Hi, everyone. Do you remember where we left Joseph last week? In prison. Remember, he had just interpreted the chief baker and the chief cupbearer's dreams. And remember that those interpretations, which came from God, had come true, of course. Well, remember Joseph? Remember how he had spoken to the chief cupbearer and he had said, please, when you go back to Pharaoh, please tell him about me. I was a Hebrew. I was taken forcibly from my country. And even here, I haven't done anything wrong. And here I am in prison. Please tell him about me and see if he'll release me from this dungeon. Well, do you remember what happened? The chief cupbearer, he had forgotten all about Joseph. But there was someone who hadn't forgotten about Joseph. Do you know who that was? That was God. God hadn't forgotten Joseph, and Joseph was still trusting God. So Joseph, he waited and he waited and he waited and he waited and he waited for 2 years. And after 2 years, something happened. Pharaoh had a dream. So Pharaoh was asleep, and he dreamed that he was standing by the Nile River in Egypt. And so he's by the Nile, and he sees a strange sight. He sees coming up out of the Nile River 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fat cows. They were big and fat and healthy looking, and they started grazing amongst the reeds. And then something even stranger happened, and out of the Nile came 7 scrawny, sickly looking, awful, ugly cows. And they went and they stood by the fat cows. So they stood near those fat cows. And there they all were. And then you're never going to guess what those sickly looking cows did. They ate up the fat cows. So they just ate them right up. They gobbled them up. They're all gone. And you know what was even more surprising? After those scrawny, sickly-looking cows ate up the good, fat, nice cows, they didn't even look any fatter than they did before or any better than they did before. They still looked sickly and skinny and scrawny. Well, Pharaoh woke up. Oh, it had just been a dream. Well, then he had another dream. My goodness. So he went back to sleep, which is amazing that he was able to go back to sleep. And he dreamt that there were, I guess I'm going to put this here. He dreamt that there were 7 heads of good grain, very good grain. And they came all from a single stalk. And then he dreamt that there was some more budding and 7 sickly looking grains, skinny and thin and weathered and looking like they were good for nothing. And they were also on that single stalk. And you know what happened? These thin grains, they ate up the good grains. Pharaoh woke up. Oh, he was so relieved. It was just a dream. Well, these dreams bothered Pharaoh. And so he thought about them. And in the morning, he was thinking, and who do you think he reached out to for help? Well, he called in the magicians and the wise men of Egypt. Now, there was another king that we talked about recently who also did the same thing. When he had a dream and he didn't know what it meant and he wanted an interpretation, and he called for his magicians and astrologers and astronomers and the wise men of his country, Babylon. Do you remember who that was? That was King Nebuchadnezzar. And were all of his wise men and astrologers and enchanters, were they able to interpret that dream? Do you remember? No, they were not able to do that. And do you remember why? It was because they were going to the wrong place for help. And that's what happened in Egypt. So Pharaoh called the wise men and the magicians. He told them his dream. He told them both dreams, and they had no idea what the interpretation was. Well, all of a sudden, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And so he said, Pharaoh, I have to tell you something. He said, I feel so bad. He said, I forgot to do something that was really important. 2 years ago, you got really mad at me and at the chief baker, and you actually had us thrown into the dungeon. And so while we were there, we met this young Hebrew man. And one night, each of us had our own dream, and it had its own interpretation. We told this young Hebrew our dreams, and he interpreted them for us. And in fact, his interpretations, they came true. I got reinstated to my position, and well, the chief baker, well, you had him executed. And so when Pharaoh heard that, he called for Joseph to be brought out of the dungeon. So they went to the dungeon, they got Joseph out, they took him, they got him all shaved, they changed his clothes, and they brought him before Pharaoh. So Pharaoh looked at Joseph and he said, so I've had these dreams, he said, and I don't know what they mean, and no one can interpret them for me, but I have heard that you can interpret dreams. And what do you think Joseph said? He said, I can't interpret dreams. What? He said, I can't interpret dreams, but God is willing to give Pharaoh the interpretation of his dream. And so Pharaoh told Joseph about his dreams. He said, first I had this dream about these fat cows, and they came up out of the Nile River, and then these scrawny, sickly-looking, ugly cows came, and then they ate up the big fat cows. And then I had this dream about like these good heads of grain, and they were so wonderful. And then these withered grains came up, and they swallowed up the good ones. Well, Joseph looked at Pharaoh and he said, your two dreams, they're one and the same. They mean the same thing. He said, the 7 good cows and the 7 good heads of grain, they mean 7 years. And the 7 ugly cows and the 7 withered heads of grain, they also mean 7 years. But the latter ones, these last ones, they mean 7 years of famine. He said, God has given you these dreams to tell you what's going to happen. And he said, at the beginning, there are going to be 7 years of plenty. There are going to be great harvests, lots and lots and lots of food. But after that are going to come 7 years of famine. There's going to be no food. In fact, the famine is going to be so bad that people won't even remember how good the first 7 years were. And the reason that God has given you these dreams twice, these 2 different dreams, is because it tells Pharaoh that God has firmly decided this is going to happen. And not just that it's going to happen soon. Well, then Joseph looked at Pharaoh and he said, Pharaoh, what you need to do is you need to find a man who's wise. And you need to put him in charge of gathering food during those 7 years of plenty. And he needs to gather up food, and you need to put commissioners in places of responsibility in the cities, and they need to gather 1/5 of the harvests that come in for those 7 years. And they need to store them in storehouses so that when the years of famine come, Egypt isn't destroyed and people are saved. Well, Pharaoh looked at his officials, and he looked at Joseph, and he said, well, Joseph, from what I see, God gave you the interpretation for the dream, and I think that you're the wisest person I can think of to put in charge of all this. And so, Joseph, right now, I am making you in charge of my whole palace. Everyone will listen to you. In fact, there is no one higher than you, Joseph, other than me. And I'm going to put you in charge of actually the entire land of Egypt. I'm going to give you my signet ring so that you can use that as official stamps, and you have power over all these things. I'm going to give you new linen clothing, rich clothing, a gold chain around your neck, and you're going to go in a chariot that says second in command, and you're going to go through the streets, and there are going to be people running in front of you saying, make way, make way. And all those things happened. And so Joseph was made in charge of the entire land of Egypt. And so during those 7 years of plenty, Joseph went out in the land of Egypt, and he oversaw the bringing in of 1/5 of the grains. And so he had them stored in storehouses, and he kept track of it until it became so much grain that he couldn't even keep track of it anymore. So he just gave up trying. That's how much grain there was. It was years of abundance. And during those years, Joseph got married, and he had 2 children, 2 boys. The first one he named Manasseh. And Manasseh sounds like the Hebrew word for forget. And he said, it's because God has made me forget all of my troubles. And the second son, he named him Ephraim. And Ephraim sounds like the Hebrew word for twice fruitful. And so Joseph said, it's because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Well, those 7 years of plenty, they did end. And the 7 years of famine came. And it didn't just come to Egypt. It came to all the lands around Egypt. But you know what? Because of Joseph, in the land of Egypt, amidst all the famine, in the land of Egypt, there was still food. Well, I hope you join us next week because we're going to find out what happens to Joseph next. See you next time.